A. Wilson Green recently completed a 44-year career in public history, including 16 years as a National Park Service historian and manager, and 5 years as the first executive director of what is now the American Battlefield Trust. He retired in 2017 as the founding director of Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier near Petersburg. Will holds degrees in American history from Florida State University and Louisiana State University. He leads battlefield tours all over the country for the Smithsonian and other leading educational institutions. For 8 years, Will has served on the presidentially appointed board of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, usually referred to as IMLS. Will is the author of 6 books and more than 25 published articles on Civil War and Southern history. His latest book, A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg, is the first of 3 projected volumes covering the Petersburg Campaign, 1864 to 65. Copies of which, of course, are available for sale, which I encourage you to enjoy, and allow Will to sign and personalize those. We're thrilled to have him here, and I welcome you all. Please join me in welcoming Will Green.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. If I wasn't here, I'd be playing golf on a day like today. Maybe some of you would too. It's nice to see some old friends' faces out in the audience. I live in Tennessee, but full disclosure, my heart's always going to be here in Virginia, and especially here at the Virginia Historical Society and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, in which I spent many, many a day in preparing this book that Jamie just mentioned to you. And this afternoon, I've been asked to talk about a particular aspect of the subject of my book, which is the Battle of the Crater. Now, the Petersburg Campaign lasted 292 days. But if there's one day that resonates in people's minds when they think of Petersburg and the Civil War, they think of July 30th, 1864, and the Battle of the Crater. And the general outlines of that story are fairly well known. A Union soldier from Pennsylvania made an offhand comment about the ability to blow up a Confederate fort outside of Petersburg. His regiment consisted of a number of men with experience as coal miners. They dug a tunnel, they packed it with black powder, they exploded the black powder, killing a large number of Confederates right off the bat. They made their assaults. Assaults were supposed to be led by African-American troops, but at the last minute, they were not led by black troops. And the white officer who did lead them was a coward, and the attack was a failure. And Grant referred to the affair as the saddest affair I have witnessed in the war. So this afternoon, I'm going to try to add maybe a few details to that general outline, maybe offer a couple of corrections, revisions to the general narrative of the Crater. And I think maybe most of you who are here have some interest in the American Civil War, and that interest might be rooted in the inspiration that the war brings to us. All of the examples of heroism and self-sacrifice that goes along with each individual story in the Civil War is something that draws a lot of us to this aspect of history. But I want to warn you that this afternoon there may not be a lot of inspiration, because the war has an ugly side to it, and what happened on July 30th, 1864 fits that mold. All right, well, our story doesn't begin on July 30th. It really begins on June 18th, 1864, the last day of what is known as the First Petersburg Offensive. And on that day, towards the end of the day, Union troops of the 9th and 5th Corps made an assault against this fort right here that was known either as Pegram's Salient, named after Richard Pegram, the Virginia artillerist whose battery was located there, or Elliott's Salient, named after the brigade commander from South Carolina, whose regiments defended this area. It's a little difficult to see the topographical contours on this map, but those Union attackers got close to that position, within a couple of hundred yards of it, but they were unable to break the Confederate line. The Confederates had built this fort, incidentally, on the night of June 17th and 18th, as they had fallen back from their second line of defenses around Petersburg. And they actually had mislocated that fort. They had put it farther in advance than the engineers intended them to do, but they protected that mistake by having a great deal of artillery on either side of Elliott's salient that would sweep any approaches to the front. Now, the Union forces realized that attacking this position frontally would be suicidal. And consequently, they decided that that was not going to be part of the program. But as I mentioned earlier, there was a soldier in the 48th Pennsylvania, whose name is lost to history, who mentioned to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, who was actually a brigade commander at that time. He had been temporarily promoted to brigade command from his former billet as the colonel of the 48th Pennsylvania, that if they could run a mine shaft underneath that Confederate fort, they could blow it up. Well, Pleasants was a mining engineer himself of some renown in northeast Pennsylvania in the anthracite coal mining area. And he ran that concept up the chain of command, first to his division commander, Robert Potter, and then to his corps commander, Ambrose Burnside, both of whom signed off and thought, hey, if you think you can do it, give it a try. Then Burnside went to his boss, General George Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade was less enthusiastic about this idea. Anything that came from Burnside was viewed with skepticism at the high command of the Army of the Potomac. And if you read Pleasants's memoirs about this, he will give you the impression, which is often repeated in the literature, that Meade's headquarters actively opposed the construction of the mine. I don't think that's really accurate. I think that assent rather than approval of the work is a little bit better description of what happened. So, Pleasants gets the green light to go ahead. He begins working on June the 25th. They begin constructing this mine. I'm not going to go into great detail about how the mine was constructed. As this illustration would suggest, 3 men were involved in the digging at any one time. One man actually excavating the earth, another man putting it into jury-rigged hardtack boxes to bring out, and the third one to actually take the excavated earth out. And they began this work on June 25th. In about 3 weeks, they completed the work. Now, Pleasants had an awful lot of challenges in constructing this mine. And the reason that Meade's headquarters was so skeptical was that the distance between the mouth of the mine and the Confederate fort, which was the target, was in actuality 510 feet and 8 inches. And the engineers at Meade's headquarters, and of course most of the officers in the Army of the Potomac, West Point trained officers were engineers, believed that this was too long a distance to ventilate. But Pleasants came up with a very common sense solution to that problem. Of course, the tunnel mouth was down in a ravine which was not visible to the Confederates, and that kind of goes without saying because they had to keep this construction secret. But just below the crest of the hill that shielded the opening of the mine, Pleasants sunk a 22-foot deep shaft into the tunnel itself. At the bottom of that shaft, he had a grate in which he built a fire. He closed the mouth of the tunnel with an airtight canvas door and ran a wooden pipe or duct back to where the workers were digging. Creating a fire in that grate sucked the bad air out the chimney, and the vacuum created by that drew fresh air in through the duct. Now, would OSHA approve that for workers? I don't think so. I don't think it was all that safe, but I have not read any account of any of these fellows suffering from any kind of suffocation. They had a 2-hour shift, and then they would switch and get a liquor ration as a reward for their work. And by July 23rd, the tunnel was completed. And then they dug 2 lateral galleries, these features right here. They were 37.5 feet long themselves. And in those galleries, they placed 8,000 pounds of black powder, brought in 25-pound kegs of black powder. And the way that they got that black powder in was also just one of these little details that you shake your head and think, oh my gosh. A soldier would be fitted out with a yoke in which 2 canvas bags were located on either end, and those 25-pound kegs of powder would be placed in those canvas holders, and the poor fellow would be bent over because the height of the tunnel was about 4.5 feet. So a man would have to bend over and carry 50 pounds of black powder, 510 feet plus the galleries, very highly flammable, with candles lighting the way down to the end of the galleries. So, I mean, we could do a whole talk on the mining construction of this tunnel. He had all sorts of problems with it. One of which was, how do you site it? I mean, how do you make sure the tunnel is going to go where it's supposed to go? And that would be an easy job if you were able to take readings. But of course, Pleasants couldn't do that because if he stood up and made readings, the Confederates would shoot him. And in fact, he was able to acquire an old, what was called a theodolite, which is just like a surveyor's instrument. And he would place a burlap sack over his head, cover it with dirt, have a bunch of fellows about 20 feet away from him kind of putting their hats on top of the bayonets above the work, so the Confederate sharpshooters would shoot at those. And Pleasants would pop up with his burlap sack and dirt on his head and take a reading and then pop back down. And it worked, although one of his staff officers that was with him was shot in the head in the process of doing this. He also had to try to keep this secret from the Confederates, obviously. He didn't want the enemy to know you were doing this. And he had mixed success with that. Men of the 20th Michigan, for example, routinely referred to Pegram's Salient as the mined fort. Private George A. Spencer of the 7th Rhode Island wrote his parents on June 29th that our folks are digging under a fort here with the intention of blowing it up. Although Private John Wesley Ringler of the 9th Corps Battery, he also reported the existence of the mine in a letter to his home folks, admonished them, quote, "If there is nothing of the above in the papers, don't make it public, as I guess old Grant don't want it known." Well, the Confederates sort of smelled a rat. I'm sure that some of the pickets spilled the beans, and there were some suspicious activities that made the Confederates a little bit concerned about what might be happening. And so they began to dig countermines. And you see the 2 of the countermines right here. They didn't know if this rumor was true, and they began digging countermines at other salients along the Petersburg front, in addition to Elliott's salient. But by the first week of July, this work was underway. A Confederate classicist considered the story that the Federals were trying to dig out old Uncle Robert out of his trenches a Herculean task, too great for even the mighty Ulysses. But I think no one exceeded the rejection of the mine's existence, because they never intercepted the mine. The countermines were never deep enough to intercept the tunnel. A man who I think wrote the most delicious account of this was Walter Taylor, who was one of Lee's staff officers, who with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek, wrote his fiancée, quote, "Burnside has some thousands of Negroes underground, not dead and buried, mining our works. He is said to have gotten as far as Sycamore Street," which was in downtown Petersburg, "and is believed running a train of cars underneath, as smoke is constantly seen to exude through the paving stones by gentlemen returning to camp after night who have been entertained by kind people who treat them to ice water and straws, which was Taylor's euphemism for getting them drunk. These, with the secession of Illinois and the burial of Grant, are the only items of news that have reached me up to this hour. As Grant has been buried, I presume it is his ghost that is undermining Petersburg, and this makes the matter only the more terrible. So, thus, despite all of these challenges, by July 28th, the 8,000 pounds of powder were placed in the mine shafts, and Pleasants was ready to go. But the mine was never a part of Grant's original strategy. Instead, what is known as the Third Petersburg Offensive, instead Grant was concentrating on moving a large force of his army across the James River into Henrico County and make a large cavalry raid against the railroads leading into Richmond from the north and the west, and possibly attacking Richmond itself. The troops that he would use would be the Second Corps there under Winfield Scott Hancock and Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan. Now, this operation is known as the First Deep Bottom Operation. I'm not going to go into any detail about that. Suffice it to say that the operation was a failure. The Confederates turned back Hancock and Sheridan at every turn between July 26th and July 28th. However, the one thing that First Deep Bottom accomplished was to draw all but 3 of Robert E. Lee's infantry divisions from the Petersburg lines across the James into Henrico County. And consequently, Grant decided, well, now maybe this cockamamie mine idea might be worth exploiting. He confessed that we have failed in what I hope to accomplish, but added, I am yet in hopes of turning this diversion to account so as to yield greater results than if the first object had been accomplished. In other words, the failure of the First Deep Bottom operation now moved the Ninth Corps mine front and center in Grant's strategy. It's important to note that despite Grant's assertion in his memoirs that this was his idea all along, it really was not. This was the fallback position. In the meantime, of course, General Burnside was preparing for probable orders to make this attack. And Burnside had 4 divisions in his Ninth Corps, 3 of them composed of white troops, and 1 of them composed of black troops, the 4th Division. These troops were almost completely innocent of any combat experience whatsoever. But their brothers in the 18th Corps, who had made successful attacks on June 15th during the First Petersburg Offensive, the fellows in the 9th Corps wanted to demonstrate their worth as soldiers as well. There were about 4,300 African American soldiers in the 4th Division, recruited primarily from free men in the North, not former slaves, and they were led by an officer named Edward Ferrero, who was, quote, quite a good-looking man with a stylish beard and a pedigree as a dancing master in Brooklyn, and fairly broad combat experience under Burnside. Now, Ferrero's foppish appearance and mannerisms generated a lot of derision within the high ranks of the Union Army, but Grant liked him. If Ferrero is taken from his division, I do not know how he is to be replaced, said Grant. Now, the 3 white divisions in Burnside's corps had taken a terrible beating during the Overland Campaign and particularly during the First Petersburg Offensive. They had suffered tremendous casualties. Their men had grown very leery of making frontal attacks, and Burnside understood very well that those men were somewhat demoralized. And it was more for the fact that those fellows were not excited about making an attack than it was for his confidence in the black troops that led him to designate the 4th Division as the leading attackers should the orders be given to explode the mine. Now, it's almost an article of faith in the Petersburg literature that the African American troops received extensive specialized training for this assault. And there's some evidence to support that. But frankly, I was surprised to find a lot of contrary evidence to that as well. Colonel Delavan Bates, who was the commander of the 30th USCT, United States Colored Troops, who was one of the two regiments that was designated to lead the attack, testified that he had no knowledge of the mine's existence, let alone his regiment's role in exploiting it, until July 22nd. Robert Beecham, a lieutenant in the 23rd United States Colored Troops, stated that, quote, "I was on duty with my company and regiment every day from the 22nd day of June until after the Battle of the Mine, and I'm prepared to say from actual knowledge, derived from personal experience with the 4th Division, that the only duty assigned to said division for more than a month before the battle was work upon our trenches and fortifications." Ferrero's own after-action report mentioned nothing about giving his troops any special training. So this conflicting evidence leaves me a little bit puzzled, leaves the situation in doubt, but I think it is safe to say that anybody who claims that the failure at the mine was a result of not allowing these highly specialized black troops to make the attack is, I think, an exaggeration. Of course, the blacks would not be allowed to lead the attack because General Meade and General Burnside, as I mentioned earlier, did not particularly get along. And once Grant told Meade to prepare to explode this mine, Meade rode to Burnside's headquarters and told him that he could not use the black troops to lead the assault. He said that these men were completely inexperienced combat troops, and this was much too complicated an affair to trust to rookie soldiers. He also added that if the situation turned into a disaster, that the administration would be accused of caring nothing about the African American soldiers and leading them to slaughter. Of course, now Burnside was highly opposed to this, and Meade relented to the extent of agreeing to run the situation by General Grant, Meade's boss. And when Burnside heard nothing to the contrary, the rest of the day on the 28th and early on the morning of the 29th of July, he made the assumption that Grant had sided with him. But shortly before noon on July 29th, Meade arrived at Burnside's headquarters and told Burnside that Grant had agreed with him and that the black troops could not lead the assault, despite the fact that in Grant's memoirs he said the idea was completely Meade's. Grant signed off on it as well. So up until this point, General Burnside, and I may be one of only 2 or 3 historians in the world who doesn't think General Burnside was such a bad commander, he had done everything right, but now he made a critical mistake. He had 3 white divisions. 2 of them were led by competent men, Robert Potter, I mentioned earlier, and a fellow named Orlando Bolivar Wilcox. Now, instead of insisting that one of those men take their division and lead the attack, he questioned if anybody wanted to volunteer, and none of his officers did. And he said, well, let's just leave it up to chance. And he put straws in a hat. They picked out the straws, and wouldn't you know it, this fellow, James H. Ledlie, commander of the 1st Division, was the man who drew the short straw. He was a 32-year-old civil engineer from Utica, New York, who by using self-promotion and his contacts with Secretary of State William Seward, another New Yorker, was able to gain a line commission as a brigade commander in 1864. His first combat experience was a disaster at North Anna River on the 23rd of May, when in a drunken fit he led an unauthorized attack and his brigade was slaughtered. And despite this, and a terrible performance on June 17th as well, Burnside had retained him in command, and now Ledlie was charged with leading the assault. A member of his staff described him as a good soul, but a very weak man, no more fit to command a division than half the privates under him. One of Meade's staff officers characterized Ledlie as a wretched, incapable drunkard, not fit not fit to command a company. And why Burnside didn't know this is something of a mystery. The one thing that I did uncover that hasn't been written too widely about this is that there was another officer who had reported to Burnside for an assignment, another senior officer, just before all of this happened, a fellow named Julius White. If any Civil War buffs in the audience recognize White, he appears primarily in Civil War history as the fellow who surrendered the garrison at Harper's Ferry in 1862. White had been sent off in recruiting duty in Illinois, but in 1864, he had been sent to the Army of the Potomac, sent to the Ninth Corps, and Burnside was told, hey, find a place for White. And maybe Burnside thought that Ledlie was the lesser of two evils. At any rate, not only do we have the worst division commander in the Army of the Potomac now charged to lead the attack, literally at the 11th hour before the assault was to take place, the plan that Ferrero and Burnside had articulated to the black troops was concentrated on sending the lead division up to Blandford Cemetery, Cemetery Hill as it was known to the soldiers, or Wells Hill, up here, very high ground. And if the Union forces were able to occupy where Blandford Church is today, Blandford Cemetery, and bring artillery up there, they would command about 2/3 of the Confederate line from that position and put General Lee's army in a very tough position. That was the idea. But on the eve of the assault, Ledlie, now in charge, told his division to go forward only to the place where the mine was exploded, stop, have other two divisions, have Potter's and Wilcox's divisions protect their flanks, and then the black troops, the 4th Division, would be the ones that would finally go up to Blandford Hill. In other words, 180-degree difference in the orders. So we have the worst division commander in the Union Army giving confused and poor orders for the assault. Okay. So the Ninth Corps would bear responsibility for this attack, but Meade had put all of his cards on the table. He had assigned elements of the Army of the James to support the Ninth Corps on its right, the Fifth Corps under General Gouverneur K. Warren to support Burnside's attack on the left if it was successful, and the Union artillery commander, Henry Hunt, would place in position 110 cannon and 54 mortars to be moved up just before the explosion to support the assault. So this was going to be a big, big deal. Pleasants, accompanied by the mine's sort of boss, the construction boss, a fellow named Sergeant Harry Reese of the 48th Pennsylvania, and a Lieutenant Jacob Dowdy, at 3:15 in the morning on July 30th, crawled in to the mine. Fuses had been run out from the tamping. I neglected to mention that one of the last things that the folks did in building the mine was to tamp the tunnel right before they got to the gallery, block it off, so that when the explosion occurred, it would go up rather than back out through the tunnel. But they extended 98 feet of fuses out from that tamping. And so Reese and Dowdy and Pleasants went into the shaft at 3:15, lit the fuses, scrambled back out, and waited for the explosion that was scheduled to occur about 3:30 in the morning. As one soldier expressed it, the suspense became painful, and strong hearts beat audibly, and brave men trembled, more from fearful anxiety than from the dread of the approaching conflict. But by 4 o'clock, there had been no explosion. Grant rode forward to Meade's command post and inquired what was going on. Meade bombarded Burnside with messages. What's happening? Burnside didn't respond. Meade then heard from General Grant at 4:35 that if the mine didn't explode, he says, order Burnside to attack anyway, which I think is an incredibly reckless impulse on Grant's part. But Colonel Pleasants suspected that the fuses had probably burned out at a splice because the Army didn't send them long safety fuses. They sent them short runs of regular fuses that weren't waterproof. And sure enough, Dowdy and Pleasance go into the mine, and they discover indeed that the fuses had burned out, but they forgot to bring a match. So they went back out. They got a match. They came back in. They lit the fuses, and then I can imagine they got out of there pretty quickly. And at 4:44 in the morning, just as dawn was breaking in the eastern horizon, a huge roar, as if from the bowels of the earth, belched forth, sending an amalgam of earth, stones, timbers, arms, legs, guns unlimbered, and bodies unlimbed skyward amidst clouds of dust and smoke, reducing Pegram Salient to a ruin and instantly killing or wounding 352 members of the 18th South Carolina and 22nd South Carolina regiments in the crater, creating this hole in the ground, this gash in the landscape, 126 feet long at the surface, 69 feet long at the base, 87 feet wide at the surface, and 38 feet wide at the base, some 25 or 30 feet deep. The blast obviously devastated Pegram's cannoneers, and as I said, more than 350 of the South Carolina soldiers. Those Confederates who survived the explosion did the logical thing and got the heck out of there, creating about a 500-yard wide gap in the Confederate line, which was a real window of opportunity for the Federals to make the assault and gain what they intended to accomplish. But we know what the orders were. And as Ledley's men went forward, they stopped around the crater for a variety of reasons. First of all, the spectacle was unprecedented in their experience. I hesitate to make analogies, but I suppose it would be something equivalent of seeing an atomic bomb blown up. I mean, these guys had never seen anything like it. Half-buried Confederates sticking out, screaming for help, and they just stopped and sort of excavated some of these men and just gaped in wonder. Ledley was predictably in the rear, never went forward with his men. He was in an aid station seeking medicinal liquor, and so he never went forward. And as a result, this critical window of opportunity for the Federals would close. Now, Meade would insist that all of Burnside's soldiers would go forward, and that map's much too complicated for our purposes. But suffice it to say that as more and more of these divisions went forward, there was just chaos, and all of the command and control that was critical to making orders in a Civil War army was completely lost. We have a 10,000-man mob around the crater. Now, the Confederates rallied pretty quickly. They closed the flanks of the breakthrough pretty fast. They began shooting at the Federals around the crater. Also, mortar shells began lobbing into the crater. And the black troops were the last ones to go forward, and they probably advanced farther than any of the white troops, but they only got 20 or 30 yards beyond the crater. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the attacks had basically ended, and the offensive had failed. And now the initiative would shift to the Confederates. Now, General Lee and General Beauregard, it was General Beauregard's men who were actually around the crater, had their headquarters in what is now Colonial Heights on the north side of the Appomattox River. But they very quickly learned about this disaster on Beauregard's front and sent orders to this fellow, Brigadier General William Mahone, whose division was on the far right end of the Confederate line, to send 2 of his brigades to try to rescue and redeem the situation. Now, I heard some mumbling in the crowd on I give this talk in Georgia. Nobody's heard of Mahone. But here in Richmond, everybody knows about William Mahone. He was a slight man. He weighed barely 100 pounds, only 5'2". When his wife was told that her husband was slightly wounded earlier in the war, she said, "My God, it must be serious, for William has no flesh and could not be slightly wounded." But By 1864, make no mistake, William Mahone and his division were the go-to troops for Robert E. Lee. Whenever Lee would counterpunch at Petersburg, whose division would he call on? Billy Mahone's. And he selected two of his brigades to answer the call. His old Virginia Brigade, now under the command of a Petersburg man named David Wissiger, and a Georgia Brigade commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Hall, perhaps about 2,000 men altogether. They quietly and almost in small groups or individually removed themselves from the front line, not to create any concern by the watching Yankees, and followed about a 2.5 mile circuitous route going underneath a tunnel that went below the Jerusalem Plank Road, which is Crater Road today, gained a ravine that you can still see today, and then marched to another ravine that was about 200 yards west of the crater. It's the worst place you ever saw. One of the Carolinian survivors told Wissiger's arriving troops, "You'll never be able to take it." One of the Virginians said, "When we first set out on our expedition, we did not know that we should be called upon to lock horns with Negro troops, and that they had charged our works with the exultant cry, 'No quarter,'" recalled a soldier in Wissiger's 16th Virginia. The information gained, a stranger would have noticed a quickening of the step, and each eye burned with a brighter glow, and each gun received a more than casual examination to see that it was properly loaded and readied for action. Indeed, Ferrero's men had been shouting "No quarter," which meant we're not taking any prisoners. And "Remember Fort Pillow," a reference to an event that had occurred earlier in 1864, in which Confederate troops under Nathan Bedford Forrest allegedly had shot black Union soldiers after they had surrendered at a fort north of Memphis on the Mississippi River. Now, the Virginians, joined by some of Hall's men and elements of some of the displaced Carolinians, made a counterattack about 9:30 in the morning. About 1,600 men went forward across 200 to 300 yards of open ground, encouraged by the prospect of fighting black troops, and further animated, frankly, in terms of Wissiger's men, of protecting their homes, because a great many of Wissiger's brigade were from the Petersburg area, literally from the Petersburg area. The sight of Ferrero's men excited in the troops indignant malice, as had characterized no former conflict, wrote a Confederate officer, creating in the men a hot rage. A vicious hand-to-hand combat occurred in which, quote, blood was running nearly shoe-sole deep in the trenches. Men fell in heaps, and human gore ran in streams that made the very earth mire beneath the tread of victorious soldiers, resulting in the Confederates recapturing a portion of the lost lines, mostly to the north of the crater itself, not the crater itself. Many of the Federal defenders fled at this attack, but enough of them remained to repulse Colonel Hall's Georgia attack. And so by midday, the tactical situation had sort of reached a stalemate. The Federals would fashion new breastworks, literally stacking the corpses of their dead men to create a breastwork facing off to the north where Mahone's men were firing at them. Artillery shells and mortar rounds pounded the crater. One of the shells striking a major from a Maine regiment, and a witness said his head and neck of the unfortunate man was blown to fragments, the body falling, sloping downwards, and the blood rushing out as from an overturned bucket. Temperatures that day approached 100 degrees by noon, and the Union soldiers were suffering terribly for lack of water. Incredibly, volunteers ran the gauntlet back to the main Union lines, draped with canteens, which they filled and attempted to deliver to their thirsty comrades. So it went on till I believe every one of those noble fellows returned with his gallons of water or perished in the attempt, wrote Captain Lyman Jackson of the 6th New Hampshire. It was one of the bravest acts I saw during the entire war. Similar examples of heroism to bring fresh ammunition to the determined defenders whose high command had long ago given up hope and basically left Burnside to get out of his scrape as best he could. At the hour of 1 p.m., the bottom, sides, and nearly all parts of the crater were strewn with dead and dying wounded soldiers, causing pools of blood to be formed at the bottom, wrote the commander of the 45th Pennsylvania. It seemed impossible to maintain life from the heat of the sun. Now, Mahone realized that his two brigades were not going to be enough to recapture the crater, so he called on a third brigade, his Alabamans, commanded by young 24-year-old John C.C. Sanders of Tuscaloosa. Sanders led 632 Alabamans on the same hidden route that was used by Wissiger and Hall, arriving at the front late in the morning and deploying in that same ravine in front of the crater. Here they waited for more than 90 minutes. The heat almost beyond human endurance, wrote one of them. Strong men fainted and were carried to the rear. The waves of hot air were almost suffocating. Now, Sanders' men were made to understand that if their attack failed, General Lee and General Beauregard, who were watching the battle from a house only about 500 yards from the crater, which is amazing to me that those two high-ranking officers would be that close to the combat. But there they were in a place called the Gee House, that as you exit Petersburg National Battlefield's main unit, it would have been right across the street from the exit there. And the Sanders men were told that if they failed, that General Lee would emerge and lead them himself on a second attempt. And of course, you can imagine that those soldiers were not about to put General Lee in that kind of a situation. Finally, around 1 p.m., Sanders and about 200 additional Confederates received the order to go forward. And what followed was the most intense, or at least it matched the most intense, close quarters combat ever to stain the North American continent. Animated by the knowledge that the USCTs had gone forward with the battle cry of no quarter, the Confederates vowed to emulate the promise of their black enemies. Men were brained by guns and run through with bayonets, remembered a Confederate captain. Confederate soldiers ringed the crater and poured volley after volley into this heaped up mass of terrified Negroes and their brave officers, recalled Captain William Fagan of the 8th Alabama. We recaptured all our lines, driving the enemy over into the crater like a herd of frantic buffaloes, said another. Then such a scene ensued as I hope never to see again. The crater was a seething mass of men, hundreds and thousands of them, some firing back at us, some struggling wildly to escape. Shattering volleys were fired into the seething abyss till it became a perfect hell of blood. In an effort to save themselves by displaying disdain for their black comrades, some Federal soldiers murdered their own black comrades in cold blood. Mahone, at last sickened by the sight of surrendering soldiers being clubbed, stabbed, or shot down, ordered the slaughter to cease. When the firing finally stopped, about 1,000 men were left to surrender, a distinct minority of them African American. A South Carolinian confided to his diary that the Negro troops are slaughtered without mercy, we not allowing them to surrender. They huddled together in the pit formed by the explosion, and our men deliberately capped down on them and beat out their brains and bayoneted them until they were worn out with exhaustion. Some black prisoners were killed while being marched to the rear, and I found, I think here at the Virginia Historical Society, a letter from a Georgia soldier to his sister that 4 black soldiers went to the rear within his view, and he apologized in his letter that we could not kill them as fast as they passed me. Not only were there no repercussions from the Confederate military authorities for this unprecedented massacre, but public opinion justified the slaughter. I think it's perfectly right to kill every Negro formerly a slave found in arms against us, wrote a Southern physician. This was perfectly right as a matter of policy, echoed the well-known Confederate artillerist Willie Pegram. A Virginia private thought that the officer should not have stopped the butchering of the blacks, for they deserved such a treatment. The Richmond Enquirer, one of the leading newspapers in the capital city, editorialized that let every salient we are called upon to defend be a Fort Pillow, and butcher every Negro that Grant hurls against our brave troops, and permit them not to soil their hands with the capture of one Negro. The paper then, remarkably, took General Mahone to task. We beg him hereafter, they wrote, when Negroes are sent forward to murder the wounded and come forward shouting no quarter, shut your eyes, General, strengthen your stomach with a little brandy and water, and let the work which God has entrusted to you and your brave men go forward to its full completion, that is, until every Negro has been slaughtered. Oops. Well, we're missing General A.P. Hill, but most of you know what he looks like. A.P. Hill took center stage the next day. He organized a parade in Petersburg in which he intentionally mixed the few black POWs with the white troops for the amusement and entertainment of the citizens of Petersburg, and also as an object lesson to the white soldiers. One white soldier wrote in a letter that he felt sure that if it was possible, most of the white Union captives would have gladly killed their black comrades rather than endure the indignity of marching as POWs with black men. Now, both Meade and Lee played a shameful game of dueling protocols on July 30th and 31st, while the wounded left in the no man's land between the lines gradually died. Not until dawn of August the 1st was a truce called to retrieve the wounded and bury the dead, but by then, only a handful of survivors were found, as the growing number of corpses swelled in the stifling heat. Some of the bodies have burst open, and the black blood is oozing from congested veins, testified a Union colonel. The faces and hands of many were actually white, with a moving layer of maggots, wrote another federal officer. With a display of flags of truce, a few black prisoners of war emerged from the Confederate lines, and the 35th Massachusetts came out from the Union lines armed with shovels, who dumped between 300 and 700 bodies in shallow trenches around the crater. And one Union participant recalled that I was on the field, and oh God, what a sight. Men cut into 1,000 pieces and as black as your hat. You could not tell the white from the black only by their hair. The wounded were fly-blown, and the dead were all maggot-eaten, so we had to lift them on shovels. I was full of maggots up to my elbows, and such a stink I never experienced. About that time I was done, I was so sick I could not stand. Now, as usual, casualty figures are only estimates, but the federal losses certainly exceeded the official tally of 3,798. The Confederates suffered more than 1,600 men killed or wounded, an attrition rate of 17.1%, which was just about the same as the Federals. Ferrero lost 1 man killed for every 1.8 men wounded, as compared to the average Civil War battle, in which 1 man was killed for every 4.8 men wounded, a stark reminder of the merciless combat that engulfed the 4th Division. Burnside's entire corps lost 23 regimental commanders. An official inquiry held shortly after the battle and packed by Meade with officers sympathetic to him resulted in Burnside being sent home, never to receive another command. Ledlie and Ferrero also saw their military careers ended. Mahone, of course, would emerge as the hero of the day in the South, and even to this day, the Battle of the Crater, along with the Battle of Old Men and Young Boys on June the 9th, 1864, are the 2 days in Petersburg that are traditionally remembered out of the 292 days of the campaign. Now today, the crater is the most visited portion of Petersburg National Battlefield, although, of course, Petersburg draws many fewer visitors than other more famous Civil War places. The National Park Service has emphasized the construction of the mine, the explosion, the Union failed attack, but with the exception of one small sign, there's nothing really that talks about the Confederate counterattacks and what happened to the 4th Division during this day. Perhaps in the future, I have some optimism because I've seen that the National Park Service has cleared a lot of the non-historic trees on the Confederate side of the battlefield, and I'm hoping that that will lead to a trail or some access that will allow visitors to interpret the battle and experience the ground from the Confederate perspective for the first time, and maybe tell this tragic story. And maybe in so doing, we can retain the lesson that William T. Sherman taught us, that war is cruelty, and you can't refine it. Thank you for your attention. Now, I understand my friend Graham Dozier that he has a microphone and is willing to direct some questions my way if anybody has any comments or questions they'd like to make.
Do they still dig out the crater? Wouldn't it fill in?
Yes, Petersburg National Battlefield was not one of the original battlefield parks. It was created in the late 1920s, and the crater itself wasn't acquired until the 1930s. And in that intervening, 60 or 70 years, the ground of the crater battlefield had undergone a lot of development, including a golf course was out there at one time. So when people traditionally come for the first time to see the crater, they're disappointed because they expect to see this huge gash in the ground, and there's a relatively gentle depression there today, although you can still see where the two galleries were. But it's really remarkable when you think about it, there's anything left there at all because of 70 years of non-preservation. My first job as a historian was at Petersburg National Battlefield shortly after the war ended, I think, as I look back on it. And even then, there was no fence around the crater, and kids were riding bicycles down through it. There were pathways through it. So it had really not undergone the kind of careful preservation for many, many years. But it's still visible. And I was there one day when part of the tunnel collapsed. They excavated it. It was a tourist attraction for a while. And what they didn't find any Civil War artifacts, but they found some insulators from the electric lights that had been strung by the owners, the private owners of the crater battlefield, so people could walk through the tunnel. And then you could emerge onto a museum in which you could buy the skulls and bones of dead Yankees. Seriously, this shows you how, and that was not considered in bad taste. It shows you how people from the past have different standards than we do.
Looking back now, what effect, if any, did this have on ending the war?
Well, that's kind of a counterfactual question, but so I don't know, but I would speculate that this plan could have succeeded to the extent of putting Union troops on that high ground. Now, what happens from there, we can't possibly know. Would the Confederates have been able to drive them back? Would the Federals have been able to capture Petersburg? Would Lee have retreated someplace else and kept the war going for 2 more years? I have no idea. The one thing that I am willing to speculate on is that had this attack been managed correctly, it could have achieved its goal of reaching the high ground, and from there, who knows what would have happened.
I had a question about Warren and Ord. When were they supposed to go in to support the attack, and why? I did read your book, but why did Meade let them decline?
Yeah, that's really one of the tragedies. Although Ord's men did go forward. They did go forward. Warren's never did. And Warren and Burnside would meet periodically during this time period, and Warren never felt it was the proper time to go forward. Meade left it up to the discretion of his corps commanders to make that decision. Warren was kind of infamous for not wanting to go forward until everything was perfect anyway. So Warren particularly deserves some minor blame for this, but their orders were to support a success, not to reinforce a failure. So in the defense of those officers who were on the flanks of the Ninth Corps, they did have the cover of saying, well, it wasn't a success, and therefore we didn't really want to go forward. I would say that Warren does deserve a little bit of censure, not so much Ord.
One last question.
I have visited many battlefields in small towns, and there are lots of monuments, north and south. Why are there no monuments to the United States colored troops anywhere to be found?
Well, that's a great question. It's not entirely accurate because I would say maybe 10, 12 years ago at Petersburg National Battlefield, there was a monument erected at the intersection of the Prince George Courthouse and Jordan Point roads. If those of you are familiar with Petersburg Battlefield, it's stop 3 on the Tour Road, to commemorate the contribution of the black troops that captured that ground on June 15th. There are a couple of monuments to African American troops in the Civil War in Washington, for example. And there may be others. In fact, I'm drawing a blank, but I think there are others at various places. But I think it's an evolving situation. To make a long story short, I know we're running out of time, but there's a really good book by David Blight who makes a strong case that suggests that part of the reconciliation between the sections, which really didn't occur until the 1890s, was there was sort of an unholy bargain between the white people in the North and the white Southerners to bury the hatchet, stop waving the bloody shirt, stop demonizing each other. And in return for the Confederates, former Confederates willing to do that, there was this unwritten agreement that the black troops would be written out of the story. And they were. If you read the literature, it hasn't really been until the last 15 or 20 years that there's been much scholarship at all. It would be, if you read a textbook from 20 years ago, you wouldn't even know there were black soldiers in the Civil War. So I think that's, it's part of that legacy that goes back to the 1890s. And of course, now there's a great deal of literature. But we're still trying to catch up, I think, a little bit on the interpretation of that. Again, thank you so much for coming out.